Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give everyone just a few more minutes. I see a bunch of people who are logging on right now, so just hang on tight for a few more minutes and we will get started then. Thanks. All right, we will go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Tracy and I will be our moderator. So we're really excited to talk about data governance. But first, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So right now, you've probably noticed that you're on mute. That's just to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar. However, we of course want to encourage active participation. So if you have a question, just type it into the question box at the bottom right-hand side of your webinar screen. We will monitor those questions as they come in, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. We will also be live tweeting throughout the webinar, so feel free to join in the conversation online by following us at Analytics 8. And I know we want to get right into the meat of the presentation, but I just want to quickly introduce our speaker today, Ken Fogarty. So Ken is a managing consultant at Analytics 8, and he's based out of our New York City office. He has over 20 years of experience in the technology, education, and business development fields. Ken has actually presented at various conferences about data governance and is passionate about helping his clients understand how to truly make data an asset at their organization. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Ken.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Much appreciated. I want to do a quick tech check. I guess, Tracy, can you hear me okay and see the screen change? Okay, great.
Yep.
Excellent. Excellent. So, I also want to thank everyone for joining us today and your interest in data governance and Analytics 8. As Tracy said, I'm passionate about this. I have a team of 6 consultants that are working with companies every day, and data governance is in their DNA to really help our customers move forward on a topic that really, if I were to poll the audience here and ask if your data at your organization was 100% available and ready, and you are 100% sure that it was correct, the chances are that I would not get many affirmative responses there, because, as we all know, the proliferation of data, the amount of data is spinning out of control, and that's been happening for some time. That's old news now. However, as organizations that need to report on data, need to make decisions effectively, and need to see where they are in terms of their business performance, having data governance in place is imperative for all of those goals. And so what we're going to talk about today then is what truly is data governance, and we'll touch on some of the terms you've heard from the past: data management, information maturity management, data governance, how all those things tie together. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about why this is an imperative activity, and why you can't just dive in with some data sets and start doing sexy dashboards. You need to really focus on data governance. We'll talk about what project concepts are for data governance. So if you're looking to instill data governance in your organization, what does a project like that look like? What does an initiation of data governance look like? We'll talk about the success factors to enable our data governance, and then finally the 8 steps to data governance initiation. So we're basically define what it is, we'll tell you what the parts of it are, and then the 8 steps to get started. Okay. Next slide here. Before I dive into the actual content of this slide or this deck, this presentation, I'm going to make a comment here that this presentation is extremely, extremely content heavy. And it was purpose built, if you will, for you, the attendee of this webinar and the other times I've given this session. Certainly my hope is that after this presentation, you download the presentation, you get the notes, from Analytics 8, and then you take that and put it into place in your organization. And of course, we stand ready to help you do that. But I want to say it again, please forgive us and me for a very, very content-heavy presentation. So I'm not going to talk through some of these screens. You'll see there'll be be quite a bit of information on a screen. But again, that's more for reference material for later, but important nonetheless. So what is data governance? A couple, thoughts on the screen there. I mentioned master data management, information maturity models. These are all things that are around the data governance topic. The definition of data governance really can vary, but some points on the screen here. Business decision makers determine who needs access to the business critical data, right, from the security standpoint and from a pure productivity standpoint. The data governance helps determine whether data resides in structured formats on the cloud, within an application, or does it need to be extracted and put into other forms. And of course, data governance helps companies meet ever-evolving business demands without compromising security or compliance requirements. And obviously, compliance is important for pharmaceutical companies and firms like that. So certainly that plays a very critical role here. And then as you see there, again, a lot of obvious comments, a lot of obvious imagery here. If your organization goes through mergers and acquisition activity, for example, tons of data governance requirements there. So certainly paying attention to this when those activities begin, that's truly going to get you ahead of the game, as opposed to going through mergers and acquisition activity and then scrambling to find out where the data is and apply it, etc. Excuse me. As I said in the beginning, this is a very, very, very content-heavy presentation, purpose-built. My hope is, again, that you take this presentation later and kind of pour over it and apply it to your organization. And again, we can help you do that. So please, I apologize for this screen. This is not meant to be a, read every word on this, but meant for takeaway. But I will walk through certain points of this. So the historical perspective of data governance is that, back from the 60s to the 80s, and even before, data was a byproduct of running the business. It was not treated as an asset. In the 80s and 90s, when the technical dawn, this new age of our interconnectedness started appearing, organizations attempted the governing data through enterprise data modeling, through technical, ETL processes to put data in to slots that the IT department assumed they should fit in. But obviously that was not sufficient for governing our data. In the 90s and 2000s, awareness of the value of this data really began, and how we can leverage data for analytic purposes, for future decision purposes. These ERP and ERP consolidation efforts began and extended into the 2000s, and right there in that first bullet point, the need for this consolidation became apparent. But in reality, the opposite has occurred. And if you think about your systems, the systems you use to analyze your data, you think about the data and things like Excel, you probably realize that a move toward consolidation is not what's happening, but rather now you have systems that are proliferating through the organization that store their own data and therefore create even more of the challenge, right? So we have to pay attention to those things. And then certainly the future, the hope for the future here is that successful implementations of policy-centric data governance will produce pervasive and long-lasting improvements in business performance. Love that first bullet point. Speaks for itself. There's some other points here, but really, one of the things you're going to hear me say over and over again in this presentation is that data governance is a culture topic. This is not necessarily a technical topic. This is not necessarily a database design topic or methodology topic. This is a culture topic. From the top down, data governance needs to be instilled and managed for effectiveness. So again, I'm looking at that screen. It's a lot of content on that screen, so that's more of a takeaway. So we're starting to get a sense of, okay, data governance is important for the reasons that I'm kind of exposing right now. But where does it fit within the organization? So the screen that's showing right now, you'll notice that we have very typical business operations. We have IT, accounting, et cetera, supply chain, of course. And in our experience as a analytic consultancy, as a business information consultancy, we work with companies that start business information competency centers and teams that are specifically shared services around analytics. If we were to take that same model, however, as I go to the next screen here, very similar screen, but notice that now my competency center is the data governance center. And you say, okay, well, certainly if we're going to do data governance and you're going to have a data governance department, that stands to be true. We're going to have this shared services department. But is that really the case? Is that really how the data governance should be applied to an existing organization? And the answer is yes and no. So as I go here to the next slide, you'll see that there still is a data governance group within this fictitious organization, and that's great because they'll need to be responsible for certain aspects of the governance that we'll talk about coming up here. But notice that really the enterprise data governance program now encapsulates the entire organization. So obviously this is graphical, this is a metaphor, but ultimately the point here is that from the top down, the culture of data governance needs to be instilled throughout the organization. Yes, you more than likely will have a data governance competency center, a shared services center, a group that focuses on this as a main goal of their role. But from the CEO, from the president down, enterprise data governance needs to be instilled, and we'll talk about why. Okay, so again, we've mentioned certain things about why this is imperative. I'll focus in on the imperative nature of these activities. And, I've given this presentation a couple times now, and I say the same thing, that there is no good technical presentation should go off without a Dilbert cartoon. So here's my stock Dilbert cartoon. and as you see there, the first bullet point is you cannot properly implement analytics without it. And the fact is that the cartoon is meant to be jovial, but it's very, very true. It happens every day in most organizations. Data gets sent around in spreadsheets, and data is downloaded and ETL'd, and really there's time spent and time, dare I say, wasted determining if the data is even accurate before we start trying to make decisions on it and reporting on it. So certainly that's a kind of grassroots point. But there's also points, data sharing. So in my very, very basic example on the screen there, somebody buys a product, right? So a customer has money, puts the product in their shopping cart, buys it, and the supply chain, or that it gets delivered to them. So the supply chain group delivers the product to them. So who needs data related to that transaction? Well, I think I'm stating the obvious when I say that almost everybody in the organization needs that data. Accounting, supply, certainly, so the logistics, sales, everybody within the organization needs information about that data, and so a true data governance program will bear that out and make that as efficient as possible. And there's the concept of data reasonability. Now, a lot of this content comes from academia, if you will, in that when we build our data governance programs and when we research best practices, we cover, when I say we, my team at Analytics Aid and my leadership, we're very scholarly in our approach. So some of these arguments here are related to data reusability. I'm not going to go through each of them. They're on the screen there, and you can get a sense of what each of them are. But I love that first one. It culminates an argument simply because contrary to tangible raw materials, data that was generated once can be reused many times. One of the things that is happening now is predictive analytics, and I'm sure that most of you, if not everyone on the call, knows about predictive analytics, and kind of taking historical data and applying some data science to it to predict future events. I just said a lot in that couple sentences there, and that's something that's certainly a specialty of our company. So if you're interested in predictive analytics, please reach out to us. But this idea of reusing an asset should be instilled throughout the organization to really get the benefit out of your data. So data reusability. In terms of backup and storage, again, forgive the simplistic graphics on this screen, but I think it very much makes sense that if we have varying data stores and data marts throughout our organization, we then collectively can say, all right, well, what should we back up? What should be backed up? How often, et cetera? And a lot of times, and I know this to be true because we have clients that ultimately make this decision, they just back everything up. Right. So as you see there, obviously my simple graphic, we're just taking one for one and then backing everything up, which certainly is effective just from the standpoint of making sure that everything's backed up. But are you spending hundreds, thousands, millions of dollars, depending on the size of your organization, to back data up that doesn't need to be backed up or that you don't even need? So obviously, if you go through a true data governance effort, your backup scenarios will be much more efficient. And lastly, data governance tools provide data security. I don't talk too much about tools and technology in this presentation because, again, I really want the focus on culture. Right, this is a culture thing from the top to bottom. We need to instill a culture of data as an asset, and then ultimately data governance. But yes, of course, there are tools, there are software tools out there that allow you to, do error identification. There are things, duplicate detection, data standardization and cleansing. These are things that a machine is much better at doing than a human being. So in terms of the technology, yes, we're going to focus on culture. We're going to focus on our organization. And when we're ready, we're going to instill some technology and tools to help us provide data security and a lot of the other menial tasks that are much better applied with machines. Okay. So the kind of the cream on the cake here is that if it is true, and this is one of the few slides that I actually will read pretty much every word, if it is true that successful organizations treat information as they treat their factories, supply chains, etc., and if it's true that in the 21st century, no manager argues with standards for material handling, deprecation rules, or customer privacy, then there is no debate over whether you should have standards or controls, accepted business practice, right, for all of those things. However, yet, it is easy to spread data all over an organization to the point that it's excessively expensive to manage, i.e. the backup of data that's not necessarily needed for backup, and you can't find it, make sense of it, or agree on its meaning, right? So culture, data is an asset to the organization. I have an example that I'll throw out here very quickly, and I may even bring this example up again later in the presentation, but we all know that Excel is a mainstay tool with regard to analytics and data in our world. And so here's a hypothetical. Really super sharp business analyst is using Excel, and this person, she decides that she's going to add some macros, and there's this process that she's responsible for, but she can bring this in Excel and use some of her experience to create an Excel spreadsheet that really is beneficial. She then shares that with her team, and now 3 or 4 or 5 people are using that spreadsheet. Who knows about that spreadsheet? Those 4 or 5 people. That's it. but that spreadsheet is becoming over time a critical piece of the organization, a critical asset to the organization. So if those folks that created that asset and worked on it had the culture instilled in them that this was truly an asset, they would know to register it with the data governance program in the organization and make it an asset and truly be able to leverage that even maybe in a much greater extent than it was originally intended. So yes, we want to make sure that the culture of our organization is such that everybody is looking at data as an asset, not just a byproduct of the business. The scope of data governance is interesting because earlier I mentioned how it cannot be successful unless it has buy-in from leadership. So that's true. That does not change. However, that buy-in from leadership does not equal full enterprise data governance projects, right? So yes, buy-in from leadership, there has to be a culture of data governance within the organization. However, two hypotheticals here. So global supply chain, integrated multinational, or global companies, integrated multinational supply chain, right? The scope of that data governance program is more than likely global. In the other example, there are different business units. There may be material, agricultural, refining divisions, and data governance may only be, an effort for one of those, maybe to get started, or maybe there's a real business need for data governance within one of those groups. And so, yes, you can do data governance through one or specific groups, but the buy-in from the leadership remains the same. The culture has to permeate the organization, even if certain groups are not necessarily going forth with a data governance project themselves. It has to be a culture throughout the organization. Once again, for those of you who look at PowerPoint slides and are like, oh my God, I apologize, this is a lot of information. Again, this information is not necessarily for this presentation per se. It's here for you to look at while I talk a bit about it, but once again, please take this for later and use this as you start to define your data governance program. But when we, Analytics, approach a client or work with a client on data governance topics, these are the things that we'll look at. So when the title of the slide here is concepts and service descriptions. So company comes to us, a client of ours comes to us and says, hey, we're gonna, we need to do data governance clearly for the reasons that we've identified. Of course, I'm giving you the very short version of a very long process or set of discussions, but when we go forth here, we'll look at business alignment, we'll look at the processes, we'll look at policy organization with business information, data, and technology, and these things are all critical and part of a services engagement, right? So are they all part of a service engagement? Yes. Will some be more than others? Of course, right? So depending on the goals of the organization, et cetera, technology may be a focus area for one organization and business process for another. But all of these items need to be considered when we work with companies and help them with their data governance programs. Oops, sorry, let me go to my next slide here. Here we go. So moving right along, excuse me, get water. So the last two major parts of the presentation today are what are the elements of a data governance program, and then what are the steps to initiate it. So we're very proud of this presentation from the standpoint of our hope is that when you walk away from this presentation, you'll have a very good definition of what it is today, data governance, what are the parts of it, and how we can put it together and get started, right? So here's the middle part of that, and that is our elements. So as you see on the left, we have organizations, principles, policies, functions, metrics, and technology. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this is not set in stone. I mean, you can do different things for your organization, but basically the point of this slide is that there needs to be a formal statement of roles, right? Culture, culture, culture. When somebody is in a culture of data governance, they know where the data asset should be. They know who to go to for things like tiebreakers. They know what their responsibilities are if they're an information manager. They know that if they're an information custodian, they know to initiate audits and ensure compliance. These things are ingrained in the culture, and if somebody says, okay, today you're an information custodian for this group because of the data governance effort, they'll know exactly what that means, and again, part of the culture. So organization, first element. Our second element is principles. So principles, as it says, there are generally adopted rules that guide conduct and application of our data philosophy, right? So an example there is data sets from external sources must be registered with the data governance team before production, use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That might be a principle. And then policies are enforced to, I like that, how it's put in that second bullet point there. The marriage of principle and policy prevents, what's described up above in the data governance program, right? So we have different policies. Different groups can say, okay, well, our group is going to take this data and here's what we're going to do with it. Another group might make their data available to the entire organization. So there's varying degrees and differing, thoughts about how data gets handled in this example. If you have policies in place throughout your culture or your organization, none of that is a question. Not only is none of that a question, now you have a lot more efficiencies in that you're not constantly needing to talk about data. Okay, let's have a meeting to talk about this new data that's coming in, what we're going to do with it. Those policies are already defined. The functions, as it says there, will be appear to be embedded in the data governance department, but really the hope here is that these functions just get to be part of a natural course of action, in the organization based on the culture of data governance. So, we will go about and do the day-to-day activities like developing customer vendor hierarchies. We're going to do and the day-to-day activities like mediate and resolve conflicts. These are the actual functions, the day-to-day things that need to happen once the policies and principles are in place. You cannot evaluate the effectiveness of something that you cannot measure. I did a lot of training, a lot of software training in the past in my career, and that was always a quandary of how do you report on ROI on training, and certainly I'm open to suggestions because I think that's still a good point. It's still a challenging point, and that is, certainly we can look at the profits of the company after the training class. Is that ROI? Maybe, but you're not really sure if that's a direct connection. The cool thing about data governance programs is there are metrics that apply directly to the data governance program. It's not just, okay, since we've established data governance, our profits are up, year over year. That's not enough to really promote and keep the culture of the data governance moving throughout the organization. So there are metrics, information management maturity metric. There's a data governance stewardship metric. I'm going to take a second to pause here to say that there are about 4 or 5 or 6, I think maybe 10 slides that we're not going to cover today. They're in the back end of this presentation. But again, please download the presentation because those slides are there for your reference. Again, very, very content-heavy presentation here. All apologies for that, but it's for your benefit so that later you can look through it. The reason I bring it up now is some of those appendices slides that you can access after the fact have descriptions and information about some of these metrics. Right? So we're going to measure our effort here. And then similar to what I said before, the technology, we work, our analytics team works in software every day. We have different tools for different things. This is obvious. This is my career. This is your career. Everyone works in technology. But again, I want to take a moment. I want to take the opportunity in this presentation to really not focus on the technology necessarily, but really focus on the culture, right? So yes, we're going to get our culture in place. We're going to establish organizational roles. We're going to establish principles, policies, functions. We're going to measure. And yes, we do have technology, luckily, to do things like, the policy administration, business rules, organization management, things like that, right? Okay. All right. And then going to the last section of our presentation here. As I said, we define what it is, talk about the parts of data governance. Now we'll talk about the 8 steps to data governance initiation. Okay, and I'll make a comment about the fact that there's 8, and and are these set in stone or not? Of course they're not, but we'll go through these as these are what are known as the best practice steps to getting your data governance program started. So scope and initiation. I'm being redundant. I apologize for this, but I've been giving presentations, my whole career, and I do know that the text-heavy slide is not the best practice for PowerPoint. So again, please forgive me for a lot of content on here. But with regard to setting the scope for data governance, I'm going right to that middle bullet point that's highlighted. This is a culture effort, right? So if a chief information officer is driving the management of data and making it a powerful asset, verification of the scope of data governance includes enterprise-wide creation and enforcement of broad spectrum policies critical. So very wordy, shame on me for having that up there, but I wanted to make sure that this presentation has all of the legit kind of scope forward thoughts. Really the point here is that a CIO could potentially be too close to the tech, too close to the data source, too close to the on-premise data, too close to knowing what needs to be done from a technological database perspective. Considerations are pretty heavy, recommendations are pretty heavy to have not a CIO, for example, drive a data governance program, but maybe a CFO or something like that. We can talk more about that, but I think it's, I don't want to say conflict of interest, but I think the forest for the trees may apply here in that you want somebody who can look at data as an asset, not a technical thing. The assess step is interesting because there's more than likely a lot of data governance activity going on in your organizations already, right? So there are, information management processes. There are processes like the one I talked about before within different groups that have organically grown to become very important cogs in the technological aspect of companies. So you really have to start by going out and saying, okay, what do we need, of course, in terms of data governance, but what is already happening, right? Because it's called data governance. I'm using those words, master data management, information management. I mean, these are all just words, but there's probably some governance going on, probably a lot of governance going on in your organization. So, in terms of assessment, you certainly want to make sure that you go through, those efforts. On the screen right now is an example of a form that you would use, and a company like Analytics 8, a services organization, when we come in to talk with people about data governance, these are the types of things we ask. These are the types of questions we ask, and we go through and say, okay, so for example, our target of data governance to support data quality under culture, information maturity. It's optional. The data quality effort is usually enforced, creating better data, et cetera, et cetera. So the appendices that I talked about that are at the end of this presentation that we're not going to go through together, these are the types of things that are there, samples of forms, samples of surveys that you can use to build your own data governance program. The vision is critical, as I've been mentioning. This is culture. This is a data governance is something that has to be a top-down. But we love this concept of the day in the life presentation, right? So it's it's a presentation. It's a one day one pager. If as you create the vision and as you communicate the vision to different folks from the top all the way through, then each person is definitely, helped by the fact that they can look at a day in the life and with regard to data governance and say, okay, well, now I realize that when I create that Excel spreadsheet and I have 2 or 3 other people start using it and it's on a shared drive, that actually is an asset. And now I can look at that and connect the dots to how that is literally helping my company, not just us and our group and what we're responsible for, right? So that day in the life document can be created for an executive, can be created for management, can be created for developers and analysts, so that they know where they fit into the data governance program. I'm going to just quickly stop here. I think you have questions. I just want to look at that chat window. We're good. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure we're still rolling right along here. Okay. The alignment and business value. This is the stating the obvious comment of the world, right? So obviously, every organization's in business to achieve goals, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit or what have you. But assuming a for-profit situation here, this aligned business value is a financial value statement and baseline for ongoing measurement, right? So we're going to not only make sure that we're aligned throughout the organization. So if there is metadata management efforts going on, we need to align with that. If there is information management efforts going on, we need to align with that. And we need to know where we're at today, so that when we do metrics for our data governance program 6 months, a year from now, obviously we're going to be able to see the impact. The functional design, oops, sorry. There we go. So the functional design is different from the next step, governing framework design, in this way. Functional design is not looking at people and personalities, etc. It's looking at literally what needs to happen, and is, as I said, they're arguably the most important step in the development and deployment of this data governance. So it's culture. The design of the program needs to be clear. It needs to resonate with culture, and focusing on that highlighted point there, it's very important to educate and present new responsibilities and accountabilities to management. Management, this is top down. This is culture. If you don't have buy-in from management, if you don't have buy-in from the top of your data governance program, chances are it's going to fail. Chances are it will not have the support it needs. So this is where we're going to design it and make sure that we have our buy-in. And then we go to our governing framework design, where we can go ahead and apply the functional design to our team, right? So as you see there, it says that this step is kept separate from functional design for these reasons, and I'll just kind of focus in on that first one. The team stayed focused on required processes and workflow without worrying about people and personalities. I've built teams, I've worked in teams, we all have, right? I'm not saying anything that anybody on this call, hasn't been involved in. I know that you really want to have people focus on their strengths, right? Somebody's a good writer, so that person should be a communicator. Somebody's a great programmer, that person should be, crunching numbers. That's the way we should go about this, right? However, when we decide on steps, when we decide on who governs, when we build the function, data governance function, we shouldn't think about personality. We shouldn't think, okay, that person has a strong personality and is technical, so we're gonna put her in charge of this because she'll kind of keep everything in line. That's not how you should go about it. You need to look at how the data is affecting the business, and then after that we can in this step apply the governance framework and apply the roles and responsibilities to the different groups. And similar points here, and kind of some gotchas. I'm gonna blow through this screen, but basically, again, it's a culture aspect that we need to make sure permeates the organization. Our roadmap, this step is where the data governance plan details the go live events of data governance. So now we're basically going out to the organization and saying, we have buy-in from the top. We have assigned critical roles to different folks. We have a data governance shared competency center, for example, and now we're going to go ahead and go live. Here are the dates. Here's what's going to happen. Here's your day in life. This is all the information that's going to really put the rubber to the road and get that data governance program instilled and start to move towards becoming transparent. This is not on the slide here and not mentioned yet, but ultimately data governance, because it's a culture thing, because it needs to be ingrained in the DNA, the hope is that after a year or two or some time frame, that's obviously different for every group, the hope is the data governance goes away. People just know when data comes in the door what to do. They know that when they create a spreadsheet and there's multiple people using it, what to do in that case. And then certainly to get to that point, to get to the point that I just kind of described, we're going to have to sustain the initial rollout, right? So we roll out and sustain this. And as it says on the screen, until data governance is totally internalized, there will be need to manage this transformation from non-governed data to governed data assets. It will be, it's not going to be easy, because, changing technical aspects of things, I don't know, that's not easy either. I mean, I've been through many migrations and deployments, but ultimately it's a more of a black and white thing. Here, we need to look people in the eye and say, this is how we're going to do this is how we feel about things within this organization. This is how we handle things in this organization. And when you, as a human being, get presented with something, we want you to instinctively go this direction, because that's where our data governance is pointing us, right? So we need to make sure that until data governance is totally internalized, that it needs to be managed. And then, again, visible support has to be top down from the CEO, from the leadership office on down, especially if data governance is really, being put in place to fix something, or really, get a company to an ambitious profit goal, et cetera. And so here's, the activities under this rollout and sustain. Again, kind of obvious based on what I was just saying, but we're going to initiate our data governance operation rollout. We're going to execute the change plan. I have not said change management much, the phrase in this presentation, but I think it's been very, very obvious that change management is critical in this, because it is a culture change, right? So it could literally be a whole nother webinar, and Tracy, maybe we'll do a webinar just on change management, but again, when you're talking about turning the ship from a culture perspective, certainly change management and how people's jobs are going to be affected should be something to really focus on. And then to go forward, we need to confirm our effectiveness of our operations. Obviously, if we're doing this culture change, we need to focus on those metrics and make sure that our organization is truly, moving forward. So as I wrap up here, there's going to be one more slide. We'll ask for questions and answers. But so, again, this data governance concept is one of those that it's kind of obvious. You say, well, should we do data governance? Yes, of course you should do data governance. But the question really should be, does our organization look at data as an asset from the top down? Does our CEO, does our president understand the value of data, and does our CEO, does our president, does the leadership committee, whoever your organization dynamic, whatever your organization dynamic is, do they understand that unlike our tangible assets, data is an asset today and tomorrow and can be reused going forward, right? So we need to make sure that that's permeates through the culture. This data governance organization is not a standalone brand new department. This is bullet point number 2. A little bit of a grain of salt, because earlier in my presentation I said, hey, you can make this should make this a standalone kind of area of your organization. But really the point of that bullet point is, as I was saying before, data governance permeates the organization. Yes, there may be a group that drives it. Yes, there may be a group that does audits. However, it's everybody's job to adhere to data governance. And then, lastly, and this is also kind of stating the obvious, but data governance, even if started as a standalone concept, needs to be tied to an initiative. I think that's probably pretty obvious, because any data that you have within your organization should be tied to some sort of initiative, even if it's internal HR related or what have you. But yes, to be able to truly measure your ROI, if there's an initiative at the organization, and there always is, that we can choose, we can get that buy-in, talk about culture throughout the organization, and then say, okay, and here's what we're going to do with this data, and then subsequent other data sets, et cetera, fall, under the data governance program. So, to summarize, like I said, I'll go to this last screen here. So to summarize, it really, when you consider your organization, I'd like you to think about your leadership and the culture, and think about what the reaction of your leadership would be to a culture change to look at data in this way. You may work for a technical company. You may work for an organization that's in the IT world, and that might be an easier discussion to have. If you're in any other retail, manufacturing, et cetera, certainly folks are aware of data and its importance, but are they truly aware of data as an asset? Are they really taking advantage of reusability? Ask yourself these questions. Enlist the help of an organization like Analytics 8 to come in, to share best practices, to share examples from other organizations, and really, get your culture on the right track towards data governance. So, Tracy, I see 2 quick questions there. I'm not sure. I'm pretty much at the end here. I'm not sure if you want me to address those or.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and address those, that would be great.
Okay, great. Sorry, my screen is a little wonky here. Actually, I apologize. One quick second. My window kind of just screwed up on me. Okay. All right, so first question. How would this scale for a small organization like a nonprofit that's never had data governance before? So, and Stephanie, thank you for asking that question. So, to me, I think that that's the best case, I shouldn't say best case scenario. There are different size organizations, small organizations, large, and their size for whatever reason they are. However, I get the question a lot when I give this presentation. If you were starting from scratch, if you were literally starting a company day one, how would you go about this? And the answer is simple. I would follow these best practices. I would make sure that day one, the CEO, president knew, what data governance was and what that meant for our organization. And then, we would apply these policies and procedures, et cetera. So Stephanie, for a small organization, I would still follow all of these steps just on a smaller scale. And the fact is that I think it's much less of a challenge because changing the culture of a small organization, I think is, again, stating the obvious, is easier said than done for a bigger organization. So, and as your small organization grows, then you can bring along your data governance topics. So I think it really, the size of the organization, I don't want to say is irrelevant, but it really is it does not make a critical difference in terms of size. Another question. How can the data governance program ever just go away because part of the culture? Wouldn't it need to live on in perpetuity because there are always staff changes, management changes, new initiatives, et cetera? So, so Susan, thank you very much for that question. And, so let me kind of restate here. The hope, I said the hope that is that the data governance program really goes away, becomes invisible, I guess. It's really either how I said it or how I should have said it. It's the data governance culture is always in the organization. I think the idea there, I'll use one of your examples, Susan, if there's new staff changes or, management changes, if it's a culture, here at Analytics 8, we have a culture. I could get any of my teammates that happen to be on the call right now to pop on and talk about our culture. We have an absolute culture here at Analytics 8, and when new people come on, they're maybe brought on because they'll fit in the culture, and or B, they're the type of person that is willing to kind of understand what goes on in this new organization. So really, new person comes on, gets immersed in the culture, and day one, day two, day three, everybody that is there already is talking about data governance. It's talking about the fact that, okay, okay, when data comes in, we need to do this. It's just part of the DNA of the company. So I think that data governance never will truly go away, never truly be invisible. But that's probably another way to just say, make it the culture, make it part of the DNA. I mean, when I get up every morning, I brush my teeth. I mean, that's just, I don't even think about it. And hopefully that's what we get to with our organizations. They come in every morning and that data is, okay, can we reuse that? Okay, here's new data. We need to do this to it because it's part of our DNA. And hopefully that answers those questions. And one more question I have here. We talked about the CIO, and if the CIO drives data governance and what to be careful of there. The question is, what other positions typically do you see being put in information custodian roles, et cetera? So I mentioned it before when we were talking that the chief finance officer, the CFO, marketing officer. I don't want to say that it doesn't matter. The title certainly doesn't matter. But I think that point of almost a conflict of interest, a forest for the trees situation. If you have a leader that didn't grow up in IT, didn't grow up building databases, but obviously knows the value of data, that person is probably better suited to ask the right questions. It's probably better suited to just assume that data sharing is going to happen, as opposed to being mired in, okay, well, I'm a CIO, we should do data governance, and oh God, now I have to buy more hardware. So that person's thought may not be as pure, for lack of a better word, than a CFO or some other leader. So that's all the questions I have here. I thank you all very, very much for the time, and I know Tracy's going to come back on here and tell you how to do some different follow-ups and such. But I really appreciate it. I'm very passionate about this. I want everyone to truly think about their organization and just think about the data that's being transferred back and forth. Is it really managed? Is it really being tracked? Can you get to it at the moment's notice, if you need to? And if the answer is no to really any of these things, really consider, talking to analytics aid. I mean, I'm absolutely willing to talk to anybody about this topic. Passionate about it, love it. And so, let's get some sanity back into our organizations, and let's start realizing that our data, is far more useful than maybe it's being looked at as today. So, Tracy, that's all I have. If you want to jump
Great.
back on here.
Sure. Yes, thanks. Thanks so much, Ken, for presenting today. And thanks again to everyone here who joined, for taking the time out of your day to listen to this presentation. So just wanted to go over a couple of closing items. So as Ken mentioned, we will send everyone a follow-up email, which contains a link to the recording of this webinar in case you want to listen to it later. And also we can provide a link so that you can download this presentation. Another thing too that we'll include in this email is a great way, if you kind of are wondering how to get started with data governance and strategy and all that, is that we do offer free 30-minute data strategy meetings with one of our analytics experts, and we can talk about things like how you get started with your data strategy, data governance, where you're at now, where you want to go. So that's just a good way, and you would actually be talking to a real consultant, not someone in sales, someone who really is doing this day-to-day work. So again, I'll include a link if you're interested in that on how to sign up. With that, we'll go ahead and conclude our webinar. Thanks again for joining, and hope that you'll have a great day. Bye.